Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna Pesachim, Perek Vav, Chapter 6, Mishna Beis, and Mishna 2. Now, the Mishna Aleph brought down a machlokes between Rebbe Lezer and the Tanna Kama regarding, for instance, let's say you need to carry the animal to get it to the Beis Hamikdash on it's Erev Pesach is Shabbos, the day that I'm shechting the carbon Pesach is Shabbos. In order for me to get the animal here, I have to, let's say, carry it. I have to carry it from a public domain to a private domain. Or let's say I got to bring it from the Tchum. I got to bring it from outside the Tchum Shabbos, the 2,000 cubits that you get from your residence on Shabbos. Or let's say I need to cut off its wart because of the fact that otherwise it's not going to be kosher. It's not going to be valid to be used for the sacrifice. So the comment said you can't. These things, even though the slaughtering does override Shabbos, these things that we just mentioned do not override Shabbos. The Tanna Kama said the reason is because of the fact that if you can do them before Shabbos, you got to do it before Shabbos. What you can't do before Shabbos, you can do on Shabbos. Rebbe Lezer said, nope, it overrides Shabbos. According to Rebbe Lezer, anything you need for a mitzvah is going to override Shabbos. If the mitzvah itself overrides Shabbos, anything that's machshir, anything that allows you to do the mitzvah, anything that helps you get the mitzvah done, is going to be permissible also. So now this is the point where Mishnah Beis starts from. But it's just important to know that for the discussion of Mishnah Beis, again, what I mentioned, Rebbe Lezer says that the things, machshirei mitzvah, the things you need to get you, the things that you need to do in order to be able to do the mitzvah, you can do it. According to Rebbe Lezer, whether it entails a rabbinic prohibition or Torah prohibition, either one is permissible. The discussion, though, the specific examples that we discussed in the Mishnah Aleph, were all rabbinic prohibitions. And we'll see why. But they're all rabbinic prohibitions. And Rebbe Lezer's discussion now is going to be regarding looking at it from the point of rabbinic prohibition. He holds even a Torah prohibition is going to override Shabbos if you need it for the mitzvah. But his discussion now is going to be that even if you don't agree with me regarding a Torah prohibition, I'm going to make an argument that you should agree with me when it comes to rabbinic prohibition. So I'm Rebbe Lezer. Rebbe Lezer said, V'aloi dinu, can't we make the following logical argument? Ma im shchita shemishum malacha doiches haShabbos. We know that slaughtering the carbon Pesach on Shabbos, that for sure everybody says slaughtering the animal, override Shabbos. Slaughtering an animal on Shabbos any other time is a Torah prohibition. And nonetheless, we say that even though it's a Torah prohibition, it is overridden for the purposes of being able to fulfill the mitzvah of carbon Pesach. Elu, these, meaning the examples we just gave, which again, carrying it from a private domain to a private domain, bringing it in from the Tchum Shabbos, cutting off the wart. Elu shemishum shvus. These that are only prohibited because they're only a rabbinic prohibition. These that are only forbidden from rabbinic law. Should they not override Shabbos? So here's his argument, right? Just to get the actual argument. The logic is kal v'chomer, right? If shchita, which is a Torah prohibition and more serious, is the fact that you need it for the carbon Pesach overrides the prohibition of shchita of slaughtering on Shabbos, or the more so, the mitzvah of carbon Pesach should override something that's only rabbinic prohibition. Now, the thing is like this. We have to right now stop and explain the three examples I'm discussing. Why are they a rabbinic prohibition? I mean, we're talking about bringing an animal from a public domain to a private domain. That's a Torah prohibition, isn't it? But the answer is we're talking about carrying an animal. Okay? We're not talking about leading it. We're talking about carrying it. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, carrying an animal or carrying a person from a public domain to a private domain is a rabbinic prohibition because we have a rule called chai noisei es atzmai. A living thing carries itself. The living thing, somehow or another, the living thing kind of helps it be carried. Meaning you're carrying it, but the fact with a live thing, if it's dead weight, there's nothing on you're carrying it completely. Something alive, we say that in some way it contributes to help you carry. You're not completely carrying it, and therefore it's not a Torah prohibition. It's only a rabbinic prohibition. So that's how the example of transferring from a public domain to private domain is only rabbinic prohibition. Tchum Shabbos, the fact you're bringing it, you're not allowed to go beyond 2,000 cubits. You're not allowed to bring something from 2,000 cubits away from your residence, something that was in your residence, you can't take it out 2,000 cubits more than your residence. Okay, now we're talking about the animal, or its residence rather. The animal was outside the tchum. The animal was outside of 2,000 cubits of your residence, right? And now wherever it is, when Shabbos began, if it's outside, so 1 second. Okay, I'm sorry. This animal was outside of the tchum. It was beyond the 2,000 cubits of your residence. You're bringing that. You're bringing that from outside of the tchum to where you needed the Beis Hamikdash. That's a Torah prohibition, rabbinic prohibition. It's a rabbinic prohibition. The whole prohibition of Tchum Shabbos, the whole idea of this limit of 2,000 cubits from your residence, whether it's yourself, whether it's an object, is rabbinic prohibition. The third example, like cutting off a wart. Now, cutting off a wart, that's basically that's cutting off a part of the animal, right? It grows out of the animal, and you're cutting it off. That is gozes. That's like shearing. That's Torah prohibition. But all Torah prohibitions on Shabbos, all prohibitions of Shabbos are only going to be considered Torah prohibition if you do it in the usual manner. If you do it in an unusual manner, then it goes down a notch. It's not a Torah prohibition, it's a rabbinic prohibition. So if I cut off the wart, how do you typically cut off a wart? Use a knife. You slice it off. Instead, you bit it off. You pulled it off. So therefore, since it was done with a sheen, it was an unusual manner, it's only a rabbinic prohibition. So therefore, Rebbe Lezer says, if all these three things that we've been discussing, which you need in order to do the mitzvah, are only rabbinic prohibition, so he argues, if you override a Torah prohibition of Shabbos in order to do the Korban Pesach, well, the more so you should be able to override a rabbinic prohibition. Or my Lord Rabbi Yeshua. Yeshua said to him, Yom Tov Yechiach, I will show you from Yom Tov that your argument does not hold water. Shetiru by Mishum Malacha, because they permitted a person to do what would actually be forbidden according to the Torah on Yom Tov. But nonetheless, they still forbade a rabbinic prohibition. We're talking about here on Yom Tov. What's a Torah prohibition that is permitted to do? Cooking, right? Cooking is a Torah prohibition on Shabbos, but on Yom Tov you're allowed to do it. Okay. However, at the same time, if let's say can you bring on Yom Tov, can you bring a food from outside the tchum to inside the tchum? The answer is not if you could have done not if you could have done it before. Then if you could have done it before Yom Tov. Could have done it before Yom Tov, you can't do it. So here you find an example of Yom Tov is an example. Yom Tov is an example where Torah prohibitions are permitted, or rabbinic prohibitions are not. You can cook on Yom Tov, which would be a Torah prohibition on Shabbos, but you can't bring it in from outside the tchum on Yom Tov. If you could have done it before Yom Tov, that's a shvus, that's a rabbinic prohibition. So this argument that you say that if you tell me that if you see that a Torah prohibition is overridden, or the more it's a rabbinic prohibition, look at Yom Tov. Yom Tov proves that that's not necessarily true. You can have Torah prohibitions being permitted and rabbinic prohibitions not. Or my Lord Rebbe Eliezer, Rebbe Eliezer said to him, Maza Yeshua, what proof is this, Yeshua? Mara ayah reshus lemitzvah. How can you make a proof from something voluntary, something that's a mitzvah? You're bringing me a proof from eating on Yom Tov, right? Eating on Yom Tov, we find Torah prohibitions being permitted, rabbinic prohibitions not being permitted. But Yom Tov, Rebbe Eliezer says, is a reshus. It's voluntary. Eating on Yom Tov is voluntary. Cooking, thank you. Cooking on Yom Tov is voluntary. And eating is also voluntary. That's going to be relevant. But thank you, point that out. Cooking on Yom Tov is voluntary. There is no mitzvah to cook on Yom Tov. And therefore, okay, so there you can tell me, all right, Torah prohibition, yes, rabbinic prohibition, no. But here we're talking about a mitzvah. Korban Pesach is a mitzvah. So you're going to show me that, you're going to tell me because there's a distinction by something that's not a mitzvah between a Torah prohibition and rabbinic prohibition, is that going to be a proof that we're dealing with a mitzvah? You're dealing with a mitzvah, you're going to say there's a stronger reason to say that the rabbinic prohibition should be permitted because it's a mitzvah. So just because we find that when something where something is not a mitzvah, like cooking on Shabbat, cooking on Yom Tov, but something is not a mitzvah, and you see, well, there we allow Torah prohibitions, not rabbinic prohibitions. Okay, there was no mitzvah involved there. But here there's a mitzvah involved. Here there is a mitzvah involved. We should apply that argument that if for the sake of a mitzvah, I can override a Torah prohibition, or the more so for rabbinic prohibition. So we have now come to a point of the end of discussion between Rabbi Yeshua and Rebbe Eliezer. Rebbe Eliezer made a kal v'chomer. He made an argument to say, if I can override a Torah prohibition for carbon Pesach, all the more so for rabbinic prohibition. Yeshua said, what do you mean? Look at Yontif. There you find Torah prohibitions being overridden, not rabbinic. And Rebbe Lezer responded, oh, over there's no mitzvah. Here we're talking about a mitzvah. So now, what would Rabbi Yeshua say back to Rebbe Lezer? What did Rabbi Yeshua say back to Rebbe Lezer? Rabbi Yeshua said back to Rebbe Lezer, it's a mitzvah to eat on Yontif. So I have a mitzvah there too. And you still see the distinction. Yeah. So it seems like Rebbe Lezer was saying, not necessarily a mitzvah to eat on Yontif.
Would you say it's a more general?
It's not a mitzvah to eat on Yontif. It's considered a voluntary thing, and therefore he argued you can't use that as a proof to come in Pesach. Rabbi Yeshua says eating on Yontif is also a mitzvah, so it's the same idea. And you still see the distinction between a Torah prohibition and rabbinic prohibition. Now, Heish Rabbi Akiva v'Amar. Rabbi Akiva responded. It was his turn now to try to respond to Rebbe Lezer. Hazah toichiach, sprinkling boshoyu. Sprinkling here means like this. According to Torah law, if you come into contact with a dead body, if you become tamei through a dead body, the only way you become pure is by being sprinkled with the paraduma water. Paraduma was the red cow. They burnt it up. The ashes were mixed with spring water and had to be sprinkled on a person 3 days after becoming tamei and 7 days after, and the third and seventh day after becoming impure. If you are not sprinkled, you cannot partake of a sacrifice. Here we have a person who became tamei through a dead person, became ritually impure from a dead person before Pesach. His final day for sprinkling is Erev Pesach. Okay? And if it wouldn't be Shabbos, everything would be smooth. Get sprinkled, now you can eat from the carbon Pesach. If you eat from the carbon Pesach, you can be included in the carbon Pesach. Mm-hmm. But today it's Shabbos. And a person generally cannot be sprinkled with paraduma water on Shabbos because the person is being fixed. It resembles fixing something on Shabbos. Because before you were impure and couldn't do things, now you're pure and you could do things. So generally you can't be sprinkled paraduma water on Shabbos. Now this guy, in his situation, it's Erev Pesach. It's Shabbos Erev Pesach. He's only going to be able to partake of the carbon Pesach if he gets sprinkled. Now, so what does Rabbi Akiva say? Hey, Rabbi Akiva v'Amar. Rabbi Akiva responded, and he said, Rebbe Lezer, Hazat toichiach. I'll prove to you what you're saying is not correct from the sprinkling of the paraduma on a person who is 7th day is on Erev Pesach. That falls out on Shabbos. She mitzvah. We consider it a mitzvah, right? I came to my carbon Pesach without it, so it's considered a mitzvah. V'hi mishum shvus, and it's only generally forbidden as a rabbinic prohibition, as we said before, because it resembles fixing something. The ein adoiches Shabbos, and the fact is that it doesn't override Shabbos. So here you have something that has the mitzvah property to it, the mitzvah element to it, and nonetheless, it's as a rabbinic prohibition, we're not allowing it. So it has the same idea. It's a mitzvah. It should, according to your argument, that mitzvahs override both Torah prohibitions and rabbinic prohibition, then here I have rabbinic prohibition. It should be overridden, and it's not. Now, what does Rebbe Lezer respond? Oh, wait a second. So he continues, and therefore, don't have a question about all these examples we were talking about, carrying the animal, bringing him to Shabbos, cutting off the wart, Shafal Pishain mitzvah, that although they are also mitzvah, as you said, right? They all are needed to be able to do the mitzvah. They mishum shvus, and they're only prohibited rabbinically. Shabbos, they also don't override Shabbos. So he gave an example of something that says, look, here's a clear example. It's rabbinic prohibition. It's not overridden for the purpose of doing a mitzvah. Rebbe Lezer said to him, you know what? My whole discussion includes that too. If shechita, which is a forbidden activity on Shabbos from the Torah, overrides Shabbos for the sake of the carbon Pesach, hazah shehi mishum shvus, hazah that's only rabbinic prohibition, like the other examples we were discussing, ein adin shadaychas Shabbos. Certainly, it should also override Shabbos. You're bringing me a raya. You're trying to say to me, look at hazah. Hazah you can't do on Shabbos. And Rebbe Lezer says, and who says? That's included in my argument. So Rabbi Akiva said to him, well, maybe we should say the opposite way around. If we find by hazah that's a rabbinic prohibition, it doesn't override Shabbos. Shchita shchita, which is forbidden according to the Torah, in addition to Shabbos, it certainly shouldn't override Shabbos. So he basically took the Kal V'chomer and switched it around, right? Do it the opposite way. Now, it should bother you, right? But Rabbi Kiva again is assuming that you can't do Hazah on Shabbos Erev Pesach. And Rabbi Lezer just said maybe you could.
Yeah.
So he's again working with a presumption that Rabbi Lezer argued about, and now trying to flip it around and say, let's say the opposite. Let's go even further based on your Kal V'chomer. Flip it around and say you can't even do Shechita. And on that also there's an obvious answer. Amalei Rabbi Lezer said to Makiva, according to your Kal V'chomer, you just uprooted that which is written in the Torah. The Torah says you bring the Karban Pesach in the afternoon, b'm moado, in its set time, bein b'chol bein b'Shabbos, whether it's weekday or Shabbos. So you can't tell me not to shech the Karban Pesach when it's Pesach or Shabbos. The Torah says you do. So the Kal V'chomer can't go in the direction that you do. So the question is, so what was Rabbi Kiva thinking? All these things are so obvious.
Yeah.
The answer is they bring down from the Gemara that Rabbi Kiva was Rabbi Lezer's student, and he had learned from Rabbi Lezer this halacha: you cannot sprinkle the person on his seventh day if it's Erev Pesach or Shabbos. Rabbi Lezer said that he forgot, and instead of telling him you forgot, he was trying to make these arguments to remind him about the fact that it's from you that I learned that you can't sprinkle the person on Erev Pesach of Shabbos. But apparently it wasn't necessary. It wasn't getting through because the arguments kept going back and forth. Final argument. Rabbi Kiva said to him, Rebbe, my teacher, my master, show me a set time for these activities we've been discussing, which are the cutting off the wart, bringing the animal, right? Show me a set time for these, like the set time you have for shchita. Meaning, why are you allowed to shech the animal on Shabbos when it's Erev Pesach? When Erev Pesach is Shabbos? Because the Torah said it has its time. It has its moed. It has its set time. You can only shech the Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach. Okay? So therefore, all these other things you're talking about, do they have a set time? No. You could have done them before Pesach. Could have brought the animal before Pesach. Could have cut off the wart before Pesach. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva is saying to Rabbi Lezer, you can't make the Kal V'chomer you're saying. You're making Kal V'chomer that if it can override a Torah prohibition of slaughtering, it should override a rabbinic prohibition of carrying, let's say. But you can't. But there's a basic element missing here. Shechita has the pasuk that says anything in its set time. You can do it even on Shabbos. Shechita has a set time. These other things don't have the set time. Klal Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said a rule: Shabbos, any kind of forbidden activity that a person could have done it from before Shabbos, it does not override Shabbos. Shchita she'ev shel asayis erev Shabbos, the slaughtering of the animal that you cannot do before Shabbos, doiches Shabbos, that does override Shabbos. So again, shchita, you can't do it before Shabbos. It's a set time is today. You got to do it on Shabbos. It overrides Shabbos. The other things, cutting up the wart, carrying the animal, they have no set time. Doesn't say you have to do them on Erev on the 14th of Nisan. And therefore, since they have no set time, they can be done before Shabbos. It can be done before Shabbos. You can't do it on. You can't doesn't override Shabbos. One last question. Okay. Sprinkling. This person needs to get sprinkled. Yeah. It's got to be the seventh day. You can't do it on the sixth day. It's got to be on the seventh day. So Rabbi Akiva said, right? Rabbi Akiva said you can't sprinkle the person on the seventh day if it's Shabbos Erev Pesach. I can't do it before. I can't do it before that day. So it's not following the rule, and it's still forbidden to do. The answer is because, according to Rabbi Akiva, the sprinkling to get sprinkled, right, is not the mitzvah. Right? It's not going to fit into Moado. It's not going to fit into having a set time because of the fact that it's not part of this. It's not part of the mitzvah of Karban Pesach. Okay, it would be part. It's you got to make yourself pure, right? You have a problem. There's something stopping you from making the Karban Pesach. You're impure. Now you want to be pure in order to do the Karban Pesach. So the Moado, the idea of saying that the Karban Pesach has a set time and therefore I need to do it today, you can't include that when it comes to the sprinkling of the paraduma water. That doesn't fall under the parameters of Moado. Moado is the Carbon Pesach. As a set time, then okay. Then you can do it on then you can do it even on Shabbos. But that set time, that pasuk only relates to things that are part of the mitzvah of Carbon Pesach, not to the sprinkling, which enables you to Carbon Pesach. And therefore, even though you couldn't do it before, nonetheless, it's not going to be included in the pasuk. On the other hand, when it comes to bringing the animal, right, which is, again, it's helping you do the mitzvah, but you could see that as part of the mitzvah. There we say, okay, it's part of the mitzvah, but I still didn't have to do it on Shabbos. I did it before Shabbos. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.